The wind howled across the desolate plains of Black Mesa, dragging waves of snow across the dying light. The land was empty, haunted by silence and ghosts of forgotten wars. A lone rider cut through that whiteness, wrapped in a tattered duster, his hat pulled low, his horse half frozen beneath him. His name was Caleb Rowe, a cowboy once known for breaking horses and breaking hearts, now reduced to wandering the borderlands with no home and no past worth remembering. Caleb had been riding for 3 days without rest, chasing a rumor of gold buried near the Apache canyons. But the weather turned before he could turn back. Snow fell so hard it erased the world around him. He could no longer tell the difference between the sky and the ground. Only the ache in his hands and the numbness in his chest told him he was still alive. As he rode through the storm, something shifted in the whiteness ahead. A figure, barely standing, half buried in snow. His instincts told him to keep riding. Strangers meant trouble in this country. But there was something in the way that figure swayed, something fragile yet defiant, that made him pull the reins. When he reached her, he realized she was a woman. Her dark hair, tangled with frost, clung to her face. Her skin was copper-toned, marked with the symbols of an Apache tribe. Her dress was torn, her feet bare against the snow. For a moment, Caleb thought he was staring at a ghost. The ghost of the goatherd herself, caught between life and death. Her lips trembled as she fought to stay conscious. Her body was shaking uncontrollably. She had clearly been running, from men, from death, or from both. Caleb dismounted and knelt beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't dare. He simply lifted her from the snow, feeling how light she was, and placed her across his horse. He rode toward a line of cliffs ahead, praying there'd be shelter. Every gust of wind felt sharper than a knife. The woman lay limp in his arms, her breath faint and uneven. He could feel her slipping away. The sight tore something open inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Maybe it was giddy. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something else. By the time he found a shallow cave in the rocks, night had fallen. He dragged his half-dead horse inside and laid the woman near the fire he quickly built from scraps of dried sage and brush. The flames flickered weakly, casting a trembling glow on her face. Her skin was cold as marble, her lips blue. Caleb took off his coat and wrapped it around her, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The temperature was dropping fast. The wind outside screamed through the canyon, filling the cave with icy dust. He looked at her again. At the way her eyelashes glittered with frozen tears. At the pulse barely visible at her neck. And understood she wouldn't make it through the night if he didn't do something more. He hesitated. He was a man raised by hard laws, laws of distance, silence, and solitude. But survival didn't care about laws. He knelt beside her and pressed his palm against her face. No warmth. None at all. That's when the thought hit him like a shot in the dark. There was only one way left. To share his heat. To keep her alive the only way he could. Caleb lay down beside her, wrapping her tightly in his arms, pulling her close against his chest. The cold between them was biting at first, almost unbearable. But slowly, as minutes turned into hours, her breathing steadied. Her trembling eased. The frost on her lashes munted against his skin. He could feel life returning to her body, slowly, hesitantly, like a spark buried deep beneath ashes. And as he stared into the flickering fire, he realized he'd just crossed a line he could never uncross. The snow outside softened. The storm quieted into silence. And somewhere deep within that silence, something new began. A fragile bond, born from desperation and warmth. As Caleb closed his eyes, he didn't know who she was, or why she'd been left to die in the snow. But he knew one thing: by saving her, he had bound his fate to hers. And when morning came, everything would change. Morning broke over the mesa, like a ghost rising from ashes. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a quiet world blanketed in white. The cave was dim, lit by the fading embers of the fire Caleb had kept alive through the night. The air smelled of smoke, earth, and survival. Caleb woke before the sun fully climbed the canyon rim. His muscles ached from the long night of holding her close, but he didn't move. For a moment, he simply listened. To the faint crackle of the fire, to the distant cry of a hawk, to the fragile rhythm of her breathing. She was alive. Against all odds, she had made it through the storm. The woman stirred beneath his coat, her fingers twitching slightly, her brow furrowing as the first touches of awareness returned. Her breath came faster, shallow, confused. Caleb slowly pulled back, giving her space, watching carefully. When her eyes opened, they were dark as wet obsidian, sharp, mistrustful, and filled with something fierce. She sat up quickly, instinctively drawing back against the cave wall. Her gaze darted around. The cave, the horse, the man beside the dying fire. Then she looked down at herself, at the rough coat wrapped around her shoulders, and realization flickered in her eyes, like a spark catching dry grass. She didn't understand him. She didn't know his name, his reasons, or what had happened. All she knew was that she was alive in a stranger's arms. Caleb didn't move closer. He simply stood and fed more wood into the fire, his motion steady, wordless. He could feel her eyes on him, watching, measuring, deciding if he was danger or salvation. She was still trembling from the cold, though the color had returned to her face. As the fire grew stronger, she looked down at her hands. The skin was raw, cut by frost. Her feet were blistered and bruised. The edges of her torn dress told the story of someone who had fled. Through thorn, rock, and snow, with no time to look back. Caleb studied her quietly. She was young, but not fragile. The lines in her face spoke of endurance. Her eyes, though clouded by fear, carried a depth that came only from loss. He knew that look. He had worn it himself once, years ago, when war and betrayal had torn his own life apart. She tried to stand, but her knees gave out beneath her. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground, his hands steady but gentle. For a heartbeat, they were close again. His warmth against her chill, his strength against her weakness. She didn't pull away this time. Her body was too tired to fight, and her spirit, though strong, was still recovering from the edge of death. He guided her back toward the fire and wrapped his coat tighter around her. The world outside remained silent, untouched by human life. It was just them, the cowboy and the Apache woman. Two souls stranded at the edge of civilization. Hours passed before she gathered the strength to stand again. Caleb noticed the way her eyes wandered to the mouth of the cave, toward the open wilderness beyond. Somewhere out there was her tribe, or what remained of it. Somewhere out there was the reason she had been left to freeze alone. When she tried to walk toward the light, her body faltered again. She stumbled and fell into the snow outside. Caleb followed, pulling her back before the cold could claim her once more. She looked up at him then, exhaustion heavy in her gaze, but something else flickered behind it. Trust, fragile but real. He knew she didn't understand his words, but she could feel his intent. The way he moved, the way he shielded her from the wind, the way he never turned his back on her, it all spoke louder than language. He built another fire, larger this time, just outside the cave. He needed to melt snow for water, needed to find something to eat. His horse was too weak to travel, and hunting in this weather would be near impossible. Still, he had survived worse odds before. As the day wore on, he left her resting near the warmth, while he set traps for small game. When he returned at dusk, he found her sitting upright, staring into the fire. Her eyes followed him as he cooked what little he'd caught. 2 rabbits and a handful of pine nuts. She didn't reach for the food immediately, as though uncertain whether to trust it or him. He divided the meal anyway, placing a portion before her. She hesitated, then accepted it. It was a small thing, a simple exchange. But in the harsh silence of that wilderness, it meant everything. That night, the wind returned, not as fierce as before but enough to chill their bones. Caleb prepared for another long vigil. He saw her watching him, hesitant, uncertain, but no longer afraid. She understood what the cold could do, what the night could take if left unchecked. When she lay down near the fire, he spread his coat beside her again. The cold crept closer, gnawing at their edges. There were no words, no plans, only the shared knowledge that warmth was life. She inched closer to him, trembling, and without speaking, he pulled her against him once more. The snow whispered outside the cave, and the fire crackled softly. Beneath its glow, two strangers, once enemies by blood and fate, shared the only thing that mattered in that frozen world, the will to survive. But as sleep pulled them under, Caleb's mind was not at rest. The questions haunted him. Who was she running from? What blood had been spilled behind her steps? And how long before that danger found them here, in this fragile piece carved out of winter? Morning would bring answers, or more danger. Either way, their story was only beginning. The storm had passed, leaving the land quiet, too quiet. The snow lay deep across the mesa, glistening beneath a pale morning sun that felt colder than the night before. The wind was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness that made every sound echo through the canyon, like a warning. Caleb stepped out of the cave, pulling his hat low to shield his eyes from the glare. His boots crunched through the frozen crust as he walked toward the ridge overlooking the valley. From there, he could see miles of untouched snow. The land was beautiful, but it carried a strange weight, an emptiness that whispered of danger. Then he saw them. Faint, buried tracks leading up the slope. Hoof prints, not his, not from the night before. There were 3 sets, maybe 4, men on horseback, moving slow, searching. Caleb crouched down, brushing away a layer of snow to be sure. The tracks were fresh, less than a day old. He followed them with his eyes until they disappeared into the tree line to the east. Whoever they were close enough to find the cave if they kept searching. And something in the pattern of those tracks told him what kind of men they were. Hunters. Behind him, the Apache woman stood in the mouth of the cave, wrapped in his coat. The wind tugged gently at her hair as she watched him. Her expression was unreadable, part curiosity, part unease. But her instincts told her the same thing his did. Danger was coming. Caleb motioned for her to stay inside, but she didn't move. Her gaze drifted toward the valley, and something in her eyes changed. Recognition. Fear. He could see it. She knew who those men were. It told him everything he needed to know. She hadn't just wandered into the snow by accident. She had been running. And now, whatever she was running from was close enough to smell the smoke from their fire. Caleb went back into the cave, gathered his rifle, and checked the rounds left in his belt. The count was low, only 4 bullets. He'd used the rest days ago hunting for food. If it came to a fight, it wouldn't be a long one. The woman watched his movements carefully, her eyes darting from the gun to the entrance. She didn't speak, but the tension in her face told him she understood. She went to the back of the cave and retrieved a small bundle from her torn dress. Something wrapped in leather and tied with sinew. She held it close to her chest as if guarding a piece of her soul. Caleb didn't ask. Whatever she carried, it was the reason she'd nearly died in the snow. By midday, the sound of distant horses reached the canyon. Faint at first, then clearer, echoing between the rock walls. Caleb put out the fire and motioned for her to stay low. He led his horse deeper into the shadows, covering the entrance with brush and snow. The woman crouched beside him, her breathing shallow. Minutes passed like hours. The hoofbeats grew louder. Then voices, men shouting, calling out in rough tones. They were close now, just beyond the rocks. Caleb pressed a hand against the woman's shoulder, signaling silence. The men rode past slowly, scanning the slopes, rifles across their saddles. Their faces were hard, cruel. One wore a fur coat patched with scalps. Another carried a chain with silver charms. Trophies from those who hadn't survived his hunts. Caleb's grip on his rifle tightened. He could have shot, but a single gunshot would echo for miles, drawing more trouble than it solved. So he waited. Still as stone, The riders passed by, heading north toward the ridge. For a while, the sound of their horses faded into the distance. Caleb exhaled, thinking they were safe. But when he looked to his right, he saw her still watching the mouth of the canyon with wide, terrified eyes. She shook her head slowly, as if warning him. They weren't gone. Not yet. And she was right. A lone rider had broken off from the group, circling back. His horse clopped softly through the snow, following faint prints that led straight toward the cave. He stopped just outside, scanning the rocks. His eyes narrowed at the half-buried brush. Caleb raised his rifle. One chance. One shot. The man dismounted, walking closer. His boots crunched against the ice. He reached down to move the brush. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger, then froze when the Apache woman moved. Before he could stop her, she picked up a handful of snow and threw it across the cave wall. The faint motion drew the man's attention just enough. Caleb fired. The gunshot cracked through the canyon like thunder. The rider fell, his body dropping into the snow. The horse reared and bolted into the open plains. Silence returned. But not for long. The others had heard. Caleb grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her toward the horse. They rode hard, cutting through the canyon in the opposite direction. The wind bit at their faces, snow flying up from the hooves as they climbed higher into the hills. Behind them, shouts rang out. The riders had seen them now. The hunt had begun again. The horse stumbled through drifts, lungs heaving. The woman clung to Caleb's waist, the bundle still pressed tightly against her chest. Bullets echoed off the rocks behind them. Wild shots in the distance, growing closer. They reached a narrow pass, a winding trail that cut between two cliffs. Caleb knew it from his days driving cattle through the range. It led to a valley beyond, a place where few men dared to go. He urged the horse forward until they reached the far side, then dismounted quickly, helping her down. Together they climbed into the shadow of an old rock shelf, just as another bullet struck the ground, near their feet. The horse bolted into the open, drawing the rider's attention. Caleb and the woman crouched behind the stones, hearts pounding. The sound of the riders chasing the decoy horse faded slowly into the distance. They were safe again. For now, as dusk fell, they built another fire in a hollow beneath the rocks. The woman sat across from him, exhausted, the flames painting her face with a warm glow. She opened her bundle at last, revealing what she had carried: a small ceremonial pouch, filled with beads, feathers, and a strip of hide marked with red clay. It was sacred, tribal, a relic of something powerful, and something worth killing for. Caleb understood then why the men hunted her, and why she could never return to where she came from. The night grew colder, darker, quieter. The fire flickered low. He knew they couldn't stay here long. But for now, there was nothing left to do but rest. In the stillness of that frozen wilderness, two souls sat beside the fire, bound not by choice, but by survival. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, the riders were still searching, and by morning, the chase would begin again. The fire burned low beneath the jagged rocks, its light flickering over their faces. Two fugitives bound by cold, fear, and a silent thread of trust. Night had spread across the mesa like a shroud, hiding the world in shades of silver and black. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was sharp, the kind of cold that bit deep into bone. Caleb sat against the stone wall, rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the flames. Every sound, the crack of ice, the distant cry of an owl, the wind moving through the canyon, kept him tense. He had lived through ambushes before. He knew what silence could mean in the West. The Apache woman sat close to the fire, her hands folded around the small ceremonial pouch she had carried through the storm. It rested in her lap, wrapped in animal hide and bound by leather cords. The firelight danced across her features, high cheekbones, a cut above her eyebrow. The faint marks of painted symbols still clinging to her skin despite the cold. She was different now. The fear that once filled her eyes had faded into something harder, something resilient. She was no longer the lost, freezing figure he had found in the snow. There was strength in her silence now. A quiet that carried stories too heavy for words. Caleb had seen enough of life to recognize a person who carried both guilt and purpose. The way she guarded that pouch told him everything. It wasn't gold, nor anything that could be sold. It was something sacred, something stolen, or saved, from men who didn't deserve it. He didn't ask questions. The West had a way of teaching a man that some truths were too dangerous to speak. Instead, he kept watch, while she drifted into a light sleep, her head bowed, her hand never leaving the relic. Hours passed. The fire cracked and died, leaving only embers glowing red against the black stone. Caleb's mind wandered. He thought of the faces of the riders who had chased them. Men with eyes like broken glass, who laughed while killing. He'd seen that kind before. Bounty hunters, or worse. Men who sold their guns to the highest bidder, even if the price was blood. He wondered how far they'd go for her. How far they'd go for what she carried. Just before dawn, he left the camp to scout the ridge above their hiding place. The snow glittered under the faint light, a sea of white stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The air was so still he could hear his own breath. From the high ground, he could see the riders again. They were moving along the lower canyon, about 2 miles off, cutting through the valley where the snow was thinner. They hadn't given up. Their horses were tired, but their tracks were steady. They were following something. Maybe hoofprints, maybe the trail of smoke left by the last fire. Caleb knew then they wouldn't stop until they found her. He turned back toward the cave, moving fast. When he arrived, the woman was awake, already tending the remains of the fire. She looked up when she saw him. Her expression said it all. She could feel the danger closing in too. They needed to move before the sun rose high enough to expose their trail. Caleb packed what little they had. A few strips of dried meat, a flask of water, his rifle, and a worn blanket. She carried the pouch tied securely against her chest. They rode out just as the first streaks of dawn touched the cliffs. The world was silent, painted in shades of gold and white. The horses' hooves broke through the crusted snow, leaving a fragile trail behind them. By midday, they reached a narrow valley filled with frozen pines, and a winding stream buried beneath ice. The air there was calmer, sheltered from the worst of the wind. It would have been a good place to hide, if not for the smoke rising faintly in the distance. Someone had already made camp ahead. Caleb stopped the horse and scanned the horizon. He could see movement near the far ridge. A flicker of figures, maybe 3 or 4. The same riders. They were ahead now, circling like wolves, waiting for the moment to strike. He turned the horse sharply, heading south toward a cluster of boulders that rose like giants from the snow. The woman clung to him, her grip firm, but trembling. He could feel her heartbeat against his back, fast and uneven. They dismounted and climbed the rocks on foot, using the natural ledges to conceal their tracks. From there, they could see the riders more clearly now. One of them carried a rifle slung across his chest, the same man Caleb had seen the day before. The others spread out, checking every hollow and drift. It was only a matter of time before they found their trail again. The Apache woman moved to Caleb's side and pointed toward the far edge of the valley. There, almost hidden beneath the cliffs, was an old ruin, stone walls, half collapsed, covered in frost and vines. It might once have been a mission or a trading post. Whatever it was, it promised shelter. They made their way down slowly, keeping low. The ruins loomed larger as they approached, the walls standing like the bones of some ancient beast. Inside, there was a single intact room with part of a roof still standing. Caleb led the horse inside and built a small, smokeless fire in the corner. The woman placed the pouch on a flat stone near the fire. She opened it again, revealing the sacred items within. A strip of hide painted with symbols, feathers from an eagle's wing, beads of turquoise, and a small carved stone shaped like a sun. She touched each one gently, as though offering them a prayer. Caleb realized then that the pouch wasn't hers to keep. It belonged to her people, to a tribe that had likely been scattered or destroyed. She was its last keeper, protecting it from men who wanted to sell it to collectors or desecrate it for gold. And now, by saving her, he had unknowingly joined her fight. The day faded into twilight. The wind outside grew stronger again, howling through the cracks in the old walls. Inside the ruin, the fire glowed softly, throwing long shadows across their faces. The woman sat close to the flames, eyes distant, lost in memory. Caleb stayed awake, guarding the entrance, listening for footsteps that never came. He knew the riders were out there, somewhere beyond the trees, circling closer with each hour. When he finally looked back toward the fire, the woman was asleep again, the pouch clutched tightly to her chest. Her breathing was soft, steady, peaceful, like the calm before a storm. Outside, snow began to fall again. The first flakes drifted down through the broken roof, melting as they touched the warmth of the fire. By morning, their hiding place would be buried in white, and the men who hunted them would be near enough to see the smoke from the ashes. The morning came heavy and gray. Snow had buried the world in silence, turning the ruins into a white tomb. The wind had died, but the air was thick with foreboding. Every sound carried far: the drip of melting frost, the creak of leather, the breath of a horse outside the walls. Caleb woke before dawn. The cold had crept into his bones during the night, but it wasn't the cold that stirred him. It was instinct. That old, raw sense of danger that had kept him alive through gunfights and ambushes. He rose quietly, pulling on his coat and stepping toward the narrow slit of light that marked the entrance to their shelter. The Apache woman was still asleep, the sacred pouch held close to her chest, her face calm despite the storm that waited outside. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. There was something almost haunting in her stillness. She had endured hunger, frost, and fear, and yet her spirit hadn't broken. She was no longer a burden to him, no longer just someone he had saved. She was part of this fight now, and her will to survive was what gave him strength to keep moving. He stepped outside into the frozen dawn. The snow was deep but soft underfoot. The horizon was smudged in pale light, and the air carried the faint scent of smoke. Caleb crouched low, scanning the valley below. Then he saw them. The riders had returned. There were 5 now. Men on horseback, their coats dark against the snow, moving in a wide circle as they searched the ground. They were close. Too close. One of them dismounted, examining the faint imprint of hoof tracks that led toward the ruin. Caleb's heart tightened. They'd found the trail again. He moved back inside quickly and began packing their few supplies. The Apache woman awoke with a start, sensing the urgency in his movements. She rose, clutching her pouch, her eyes searching his face for answers she didn't need words to understand. The riders were coming. There was no time to run far. The snow was too deep for the horse to carry them fast. Their only chance was to climb higher, into the cliffs above the valley, where no horse could follow. Caleb led the horse out quietly, wrapping the reins around a fallen beam to muffle the sound of hooves. The woman followed close behind, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. They moved toward the rear of the ruin, where a narrow path snaked upward between the rocks. It was steep and treacherous, but it offered cover. Behind them, the sound of voices grew louder. The riders had reached the ruins. Caleb could hear them shouting, angry, confident, certain their prey was near. A gunshot cracked through the stillness, the sound echoing off the cliffs. The bullet struck the stone near his feet, shattering flakes of ice into the air. He pulled the woman forward, urging her to climb faster. The path narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for one person. Snow slid away beneath their boots, tumbling into the ravine below. Caleb kept his rifle slung across his shoulder, one hand gripping the rock, the other guiding her upward. The riders fired again, bullets whining off the stone. One man began to climb after them, a rope tied to his belt, a revolver in his hand. Caleb aimed and fired once. The man fell, his body disappearing into the snow below. The echo faded, leaving only the woman's labored breathing and the hiss of wind between the cliffs. They reached the top just as the sun broke over the ridge. The world below glowed gold and white, endless and merciless. From this height, the riders looked like dark ants crawling across the valley. But Caleb knew they wouldn't stop. They would climb too. And when they did, there'd be no easy escape left. The plateau stretched out before them, a flat expanse of snow dotted with boulders and dead trees. In the distance, faint smoke rose from what looked like an old hunting cabin, half collapsed but still standing. It was their only hope for shelter. They trudged toward it, each step heavy, the cold biting deeper. The woman stumbled once, and Caleb caught her before she fell. Her strength was fading again, her body pushed beyond exhaustion. He could feel her trembling through the layers of cloth. By the time they reached the cabin, the wind had returned, sharp, biting, howling through the cracks like a living thing. Inside, the place was little more than 4 walls and a broken roof, but it was enough to keep them out of sight. Caleb built a fire quickly, using broken boards from an old table. The woman sank to the floor near the flames, her skin pale, her eyes half closed. She set the pouch beside her, almost as if offering it to the fire itself. The warmth reached her slowly, painting her face with light and color again. Caleb sat beside her, listening to the storm build outside. His body ached, his hands were numb, but his mind stayed sharp. He counted bullets, checked his rifle, and studied the narrow entrance of the cabin. If they came, he'd have one chance to stop them. Hours passed before he heard the first sound, the distant crunch of boots in snow. Then came the voices, closer this time. The riders had followed their tracks to the cabin. Caleb doused the fire, plunging the room into darkness. The woman's eyes widened, but she didn't move. The only sound was their breathing and the soft moan of wind through the cracks. Outside, footsteps approached the door. A shadow moved across the wall, then another. Someone kicked the door once hard. The wood splintered but didn't break. Caleb raised his rifle and waited. The door crashed open, snow swirling in. A figure stepped through, gun raised, eyes searching the dark. Caleb fired. The man fell instantly. The others shouted, firing blindly into the cabin. Bullets tore through the walls, splintering wood and stone. Caleb pulled the woman down behind a fallen beam, shielding her with his body. The air filled with smoke and snow and the echo of gunfire. Then silence. For a long moment, nothing moved. Only the hiss of the wind and the distant crack of timber settling. Caleb crawled toward the door, rifle ready. Through the drifting snow, he saw the remaining riders regrouping near the ridge. 2 were down. 3 still stood. They were cautious now, circling, waiting for the next shot. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. His ammunition was nearly gone. But as he looked back at the woman, at the pouch she clutched, at the fire in her eyes even now, he realized something had changed. This fight wasn't just his anymore. She stood then, gathering the sacred items in her hands. She walked to the open doorway, her hair whipping in the storm. Her face was fierce, unyielding. The riders below hesitated, uncertain. She raised the pouch high into the wind, whispering something ancient, something that carried across the canyon like the voice of the earth itself. Caleb watched in silence, not understanding the words, but feeling the power behind them. The wind grew stronger, swirling around them, lifting snow into a white storm that blinded everything. The riders retreated, shouting curses as they disappeared into the blizzard. And just like that, the world went silent again. Caleb turned to her. She sank to her knees, exhausted, the pouch still glowing faintly in her hands, the last of its sacred fire fading with the storm. Outside, the snow began to fall thicker, hiding every trace of their struggle. The danger had passed, for now. But the cost of that strange, ancient power had left her pale and trembling, her breath shallow. Caleb caught her before she fell, holding her close once more. The warmth between them was the only thing left alive in that frozen wilderness. And as the fire flickered back to life, he realized he would do whatever it took to protect her now. Not just from the men who hunted her, but from the world itself. The storm raged for 2 full days. The snow fell without pause, swallowing the canyon, the trails, and the dead. By the time the wind quieted, the world had become an ocean of white silence. No man, no beast, and no memory seemed capable of surviving that kind of cold. Inside the broken cabin, a single fire burned low. Its faint glow danced over the faces of the 2 who remained. One cowboy, one Apache woman, huddled close beneath a torn blanket, their breath fogging the air. Every spark from that fire seemed to mark the passage of time, each one fading before it reached the rafters. Caleb hadn't slept. He sat against the wall, his rifle beside him, his eyes half open but always alert. His body ached, his wounds from the gunfight stiffening in the cold. Yet he said nothing. There was no one to talk to, and no reason left to speak. The world outside had gone still, and with it, his voice had too. The Apache woman, Taya, as he had finally learned from her medicine pouch markings, lay near the fire, her breathing shallow. The sacred pouch still rested beside her hand, its cords wrapped around her wrist like a lifeline. Whatever strength she had used to call the storm had drained her completely. Her skin was pale, her eyes heavy, but she lived. That was enough for Caleb. The days had bled together into one long silence. They had food for 2 more nights, no more. The horse had fled during the blizzard. Spooked by thunder or ghosts, Caleb didn't know. But without it, they were stranded high above the valley, miles from any settlement, surrounded by snow too deep to walk through. Each morning he went outside to gather firewood, breaking through frozen drifts with the butt of his rifle. The world felt hollow, endless. There were no more riders, no more voices. Only the wind, whispering through the canyons like a song for the dead. He began to wonder if they were the last 2 people left alive in this frozen land. When he returned each time, Taya would be awake, barely moving, her dark eyes following him, as though she could read his thoughts. There was a sadness in her gaze, something ancient and heavy. She knew, just as he did, that survival now depended on more than the fire. It depended on the will to keep living. The cold grew sharper as the days passed. The firewood pile dwindled, and the cabin creaked beneath the weight of snow. The walls leaked wind like a dying breath. Caleb built the fire smaller to save wood, but the flames barely warmed their hands anymore. That night, as the storm returned, the fire finally began to die. Caleb watched the last ember flicker and fade, the shadows rising up to swallow the light. Taya shivered violently, her lips pale, her body trembling as the cold closed in. He knew what had to be done. He moved closer, wrapping the blanket around both of them, pulling her against his chest. Her skin was like ice, her heart beat faint but steady. The warmth between them grew slowly, painfully, as their bodies pressed close together. The cold had no mercy. It wanted to take everything, even the smallest spark of life. But between them, that spark began to burn again. As he held her, Caleb thought of everything that had brought him here. The choices, the roads, the guns, the faces of men who died with his name in their last breath. He had never believed in second chances. He'd always thought his story would end the way it began, alone, out in the cold with no one to bury him. But here, holding this fragile, fierce woman in his arms, he felt something shift inside him. She wasn't just a burden or a survivor. She was a reminder that even in a world of dust and death, life could still cling to warmth, to hope, to the smallest act of mercy. Hours passed like dreams. Outside, the wind screamed through the broken roof. Inside, their shared warmth kept the dark away. The night was endless, but they endured it together. By morning, the storm had passed again. Light filtered through the cracks in the roof, pale and cold, but it was light nonetheless. Caleb opened his eyes to the sound of dripping water, the ice melting from the eaves. He rose slowly, careful not to wake her, and stepped outside. The air was still frigid, but the sun had returned. The snow glittered under its pale touch, and the distant valley below shimmered with hints of thaw. Spring was coming. He stood there for a long time, breathing it in. The world was still quiet, still broken, but alive. When he returned to the cabin, Taya was awake. Sitting near the fire pit, her fingers tracing the markings on the medicine pouch. The light fell across her face, turning her eyes to amber. She looked stronger now, her color returning. The pouch, he noticed, had changed. The sacred paint that once covered it had faded, washed away by the storm and the blood and the cold. Whatever spirit she had called that night had left its mark. But it had also set her free. They ate the last of their food that morning. Then Caleb gathered what little remained of their supplies, his rifle, her pouch, a length of rope, and stood at the doorway. The snow outside was still deep, but passable now. The world below called to them again, not with fear, but with promise. The journey ahead would be long, uncertain, and harsh. But it would be theirs to share. As they stepped out together, the wind stirred around them, not cruel now, but almost gentle. The sun glinted off the canyon walls, and for the first time in weeks, Caleb felt warmth on his face. Behind them, the old cabin sagged into silence, its final fire long gone. Before them, the world stretched vast and white, waiting to be crossed. They walked side by side, leaving a single trail of footprints behind them. Each step carried them further from death, and closer to something neither of them had dared believe in. Life, reborn in the heart of winter. And though the cold still nipped at their skin, it could no longer claim them. Because they had found something stronger than the storm. Something worth surviving for.